Welcome to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. We are here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City.
This week in the magazine, the Bloomberg 50. From finance and politics to tech and entertainment, these are the people who shaped 2019 in unexpected yet measurable ways.
Measure everything here at Bloomberg, plus a growing pushback on stock buybacks.
And a different kind of housing crisis that asks the question, is homelessness a crime?
Much more to come, all of that and more. But first, our top story this week, NATO's 70th turned out to be less like a birthday party and more like a Thanksgiving dinner for a big dysfunctional family.
That's right, Jason. Not all of them got along. A few snide remarks were made, but in the end, everyone seemed to accept that they're stuck with each other. That's according to Mark Champion, who covered the summit outside London. He joins us now. So, Mark, let's talk about NATO. What a week it was.
It was. I mean, the build-up was pretty extraordinary. This was supposed to be just a celebration. It wasn't a real summit. It wasn't a full summit. They do that every 2 to 3 years. But this one they felt they had to do because it was the 70th. And they kept it really short because they specifically didn't want to create a big, target for unscripted problems with President Trump, which they've had before. And then all of a sudden, in the weeks before, you had the French President Macron coming out and talking about how he wasn't so sure whether the rest of NATO allies would go to the defense of Turkey under the Article 5 Collective Defense Clause, which is absolutely at the core of NATO. It caused a huge blow-up, and then of course you had Turkey itself, which had begun a military operation in Syria against the will of most of the other allies. So, people were very apprehensive going in about, this thing could just blow up. And instead of being a celebration, a demonstration of the union of this, the unity really of this alliance, it would be the opposite.
Well, and Mark, it ended up, as we said in the introduction, more sort of awkward and uncomfortable more than anything. You had some hot mic issues. You had some extended press conferences. The President of the United States, once again, as he seems to like, right at the center of it.
Absolutely. And really the key question going in, and what everybody was kind of just wondering to themselves was, when he landed, what was he going to do? He really had a binary choice. He could either decide, hey, I will throw in with Macron. He's raising a lot of questions about NATO. I've raised a lot of questions about NATO, not just on spending, but, at various times the president called NATO obsolete. He could have done that, but he chose instead to kind of, present himself as the savior of NATO and its protector. It's an unlikely role, given all that's gone before. But the bottom line there was that he's had some success in getting the other NATO allies to spend more on defense. He's been banging on that particular drum for the 3 years that he's been in office. And defense spending has increased pretty sharply among the allies. It actually began before he came into office, but he's very happy to take the credit, and the other leaders are very happy to give it to him.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say there's been a fair amount of conversation that everybody, all the members of NATO, have to contribute their fair share. Hey, I do want to ask you about Boris Johnson. He was at the summit. He's also the subject of remarks in the magazine this week, and more specifically, his character and his temperament, his anger. Who knew? Tell us a little bit about that and how that might impact his campaign and possibly his election.
Yes, this has been a really extraordinary campaign. They're very short in the UK. One has to remember that, especially if you're familiar with American ones, will go on for more than a year. They're basically a month long, a month to 6 weeks, in effect. So they're extremely short. Stuff is really packed in, all the debates and everything. It happens very, very fast. We're already towards the last week, but this particular campaign is really quite extraordinary because you have both parties, making big plays in terms of, changes in public spending, in budgeting, in fiscal policy, all these sorts of things. And in the end, though, it really comes down to trust in the two main candidates. One of them is Boris Johnson, and he has always had a big issue with trust. And the anger is, a piece of that. And we had this article today, in business, this issue in BusinessWeek, which is really runs through it very carefully, reminds you of the times when he's really sort of flown off the handle, and people already don't quite trust him because he has a record. He was fired once for not telling the truth, while he was a cabinet minister. He was fired as a journalist for not telling the truth. So there's already a trust issue for him. He has a pretty colorful personal life, which has also raised some trust questions. And then if you add on top of that, the possibility of a blow up because he doesn't keep his temper, which has happened before, then that is one of the things that the people who are running his campaign are very concerned about, and they kept the campaign on a very tight leash and kept him on a very tight leash, and they've kept his exposure quite limited.
All right, Mark Champion, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much joining us from London. A very busy time between hosting NATO and then obviously this big election. Well, for more on this week's magazine, here he is, BusinessWeek's editor, Joel Weber. The Bloomberg 50, it's the most wonderful time of the year.
Yeah, exactly. This is like one of our favorite issues of the year, where we recognize the 50 people who really defined 2019, and we look specifically for things that are measurable, because this is Bloomberg.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting too, and you're like all industries, I feel like entertainment,
finance,
sports.
Fashion, entertainment, sports. We really try to look across everything. And that's what makes this one special. Like you could have a list of people that are, expected names, like Warren Buffett could basically be on that list every year. But we're looking for measurable contributions in the year of 2019. So we go back to January and all the way up through now to find out who really sparkled.
And even a chicken sandwich.
Even a chicken sandwich. This was the Popeyes chicken sandwich. It broke the internet.
Great story.
They had a 3-month supply sell out in a matter of days. People even got stabbed over it, which was like, the downside of this story. But really, it speaks to like the ability for brands to like harness things. And a chicken sandwich of all things, with some extra pickles can really break the internet.
So we reach out, around the Bloomberg organization. Everybody pitches ideas and so on and so forth. Is there a name that surprised you or that you found was really interesting?
This is a big team sport. We pull from all the bureaus around the world, and we're looking for leaders and business people and CEOs. One of my favorite ones was, remember the black hole? It's easy to forget all the things that have happened this year, but in science, this is a huge deal, the team that discovered a black hole. So that was one of my favorite ones because, it's a photo of nothingness is effectively what we all looked at for the first time. And it really just marked an incredible scientific achievement, so I'm honored to have them on the list.
All right, 2019 feels like a black hole kind of year in many ways. Joel Weber, thank you so much. All right.
Coming up, a pushback on the C-suite pumping up their pay with buybacks.
Plus, Soros, yes, that Soros, George Soros, and his fund, they're getting a little conservative.
They are indeed. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. Join us for Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio, starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. Also, catch up on our daily show through our podcast. You can get that at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or at Bloomberg.com.
And, of course, you can find us online at BusinessWeek.com and on our mobile app. Who wins when companies buy their own shares? It's a good question. One argument is that it's the company's executives that come out on top.
That's at least the case that Peter Coy is making. He is our economics editor. He's here with his story and this week's BusinessWeek explainer.
Last year, S&P 500 companies bought back a record $806 billion worth of shares. That's 55% more than the year before. This year, they're on track to buy $740 billion worth, the second most ever. One SEC Commissioner, Robert Jackson, had his staff study 385 recent buybacks. They found that shares rose by about 2.5% more in the days after a buyback than otherwise would have been expected. They also found that twice as many companies have executives selling in the 8 days after a buyback announcement as they do on an ordinary day. and the value of those executive sales is more than 5 times higher. When a company buys back shares, it's signaling confidence in its future. When its executives sell shares right after sending that message, it seems to some like a legal version of illegal pump and dump stock manipulation. The SEC's Jackson wants the agency to rewrite the rules. He wants to bar insider sales for a certain length of time after buyback is announced. SEC Chairman Jay Clayton has not agreed, although he says he's happy to continue the conversation.
All right, so let's get more on rewriting the rules on buybacks.
You just heard from him, and here he is again, economics editor Peter Coy.
The focus is on this other thing which has gotten less attention, which is what executives do when there's a buyback. And Robert Jackson is one of the commissioners of the SEC, not the chairman. He has commissioned his own staff to look into this. And what he found is that, as Carol said before, stocks tend to go up when a buyback is announced. It's an expression of confidence by management in the future of a company, right? So it's no wonder the stock goes up a bit. But what do executives do? They are more likely to sell their shares in the immediate aftermath of this buyback announcement, taking advantage of that pop in the stock. So if you're a real cynic, you would say this is sort of a legal version of sort of an illegal pump and dump stock manipulation.
Right, right. So this is insiders, usually senior corporate executives, right?
Yeah, and directors.
That are taking advantage. So there's been research out there that's showing that the insiders are selling right after the announcement of a buyback.
There's always a steady dribble of selling by executives.
Right.
You know, they're cashing into stock options on. But what you see is a big jump, like 5-fold increase in the dollar value of the stock sales right after, 8 days after a buyback announcement versus before. And the number of executives doing so is also up.
So what does Jackson want to do about this?
You know, you can think of a very wide solution, you know, he has a very narrow, tailored solution, which seems kind of unobjectionable, which is to, you know, bar executives and directors, other insiders from selling in the immediate aftermath of a buyback. Right. He doesn't say exactly how many days that should be, but as he says, you know, who thinks it's a good idea for executives to be doing this right after buyback is announced? Who benefits from that except for those people?
Because there are already restrictions, right, on when insiders can buy and sell shares.
Yeah, and so this would be creating a new thing that they would not be allowed to do.
How likely is Mr. Jackson's change to be implemented?
Well, I mean, I think what he's betting on is that articles in the press like this one, Washington Post had a story on this recently, will start to generate some interest in this in the general public. So far, the chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton, has not gone along with this. He was asked about it by Senator Chris Van Hollen last year and kind of demurred. He, you know, I'm still willing to talk about this. I don't want to have a big round table about it. But, you know, he's susceptible to political pressure just like anybody else. And if the pressure amounts, you know, the rule could change.
So, Carol, let's stay in the finance section and talk about a story. It's one of my favorites in the magazine this week. It's about one of finance's most legendary names. We're talking about George Soros. Well, there's a new era for his money.
That's so true, Jason. It is a very different fund and investment operation today, in part because it has to be. And that's made Dawn Fitzpatrick's job especially tough. She's the head of the legendary asset management shop.
Kathy Burton of Bloomberg News. She's covered Soros for years. She wrote the book, Hedge Hunters, all about the industry and its top managers, including Mr. Soros. Here she is with her story.
They've struggled pretty mightily with performance over the past 3 years since Dawn started in 2017.
And remind us who she is, where she came from, and how she got to this job.
She came from UBS. She ran the hedge fund business there, as well as the equities businesses and some other businesses at the asset management part of UBS. And she was chosen to run this new Soros Fund Management, which is managing the money for the foundation, not for George and his family.
Well, that's it. Take a step back, because I feel like there was a long period where George Soros could only do really smart things in terms of investments, right? And if you could work there, it was a really cool thing. So remind us of his kind of past.
Sure. So, as you said, it used to be the major, best performing hedge fund in the world, and George sat on top of it. He had great traders. They made tons of money. And then in 2017, he transferred most of his wealth to his foundation. And that meant the foundation was no longer managing money for George, whipping it around. They had to be much more conservative because they didn't want to lose money. They just have to ensure that they can fund all their projects every year.
And that's such a key point, because if you go back to the culture and the ethos of the original Soros, it was big bets. I mean, huge bets that paid off in many cases unbelievably, but swinging for the fences in a lot of ways, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They made so many big bets. The biggest, most famous one was George betting against the pound, George and Stan Druckenmiller betting against the pound in 1992. They made $1 billion on that bet, and they bet $10 billion.
It's like amazing.
To make
right?
that.
Yeah.
$10 million.
$10 billion on that bet.
Wow.
And they wanted to bet 15. They just couldn't get it done.
Breaking the bank of England, right? As
exactly.
Everybody would say. All right, so that's where George Soros is. So fast forward, and let's be fair, like the hedge fund world has changed dramatically, and we've seen a lot of hedge funds either shut down or folks take the money, kind of give it back to investors and just kind of have their own family offices, right? I mean, the world has changed dramatically.
Yes, it's much harder to make money, and now this isn't a hedge fund. It's been a family office for several years now, but now it even has to be more conservative.
Coming up, a different kind of housing crisis that goes to one of the most important issues of our time. Is homelessness a crime?
Plus, the cost of higher education. What happens when one state experiments with a free tuition program? Another big problem of our time.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. You can also listen to us on the radio on Sirius XM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area and London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app. We turn now to a different kind of housing crisis.
The U.S. Supreme Court may review a lawsuit that's made cities change how they treat the homeless. We checked in with reporter Noah Buhire from one city that is unfortunately home to many homeless, Seattle.
It's a case that started about a decade ago in Boise, Idaho, and 6 homeless people brought a case against the city, basically saying that the local ban on camping in public places was unconstitutional, that it represented cruel and unusual punishment because basically there was no place for them to go. There weren't enough spaces in shelters, and effectively they were being penalized for being homeless, which is something you can't do under the law.
This is wild, and I think it could change dramatically based on your reporting in this court case of how we think about housing, because it really gets to, right, Noah, the idea that housing is a basic right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a larger question that looms over this case. It's the legal issue is much narrower, but just to complete the story, the Boise won at the district court level, but then it was appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which covers a giant swath of the U.S. West from Alaska to Arizona, and the appellate court found in the favor of the homeless folks. So as a result, you have a ruling out there right now that says that these sorts of bans on public camping are unconstitutional, and it's a big deal because it's a ruling that goes far beyond Boise now. It's something that matters to cities like Los Angeles and Seattle, and it's created a lot of discussion in cities throughout the West about how they can tackle this giant problem of homelessness.
Well, and in your story, Noah, you do talk about some of what various cities have done, some of those cities you mentioned have done to try and combat this, especially at a time where if you talk to people in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, they talk about even anecdotally just this massive rise in homelessness, which obviously has something to do, a large part to do, with the affordability of housing. What have we seen those individual cities do to try and combat this so far?
Well, what you've seen broadly on a national level is an uptick in these laws that criminalize, camping or sleeping in public. Now, the Ninth Circuit decision really calls some of those into question, and it's made a lot of cities back away from those bans. The question, though, long term, like the bigger question that looms over this case is how are you going to solve homelessness? I think a lot of people in the West and across the country recognize that it's a problem, but there's a very robust and active debate about what you do about it. And on the one side, the folks who are arguing on behalf of the homeless folks from Boise, they say that these criminalizing people for sleeping on the streets when they have no other alternative is really counterproductive.
From the high cost of housing to the high cost of getting an education.
A story in this week's economics section explores one state's free college program. Is it a model for the nation?
Reporter Reed Pickert joins us from Washington.
The thing about Tennessee, so they were the first state to implement a statewide free tuition program for every high school graduating senior, and they could go to community college or technical college completely for free. That started in 2014, but it started as an economic program. So the idea was that Tennessee took a look around its workforce and realized with an increasingly skilled economy and an advancing economy that they weren't going to have enough skilled workers. So as a result, they came up with Tennessee Promise and a complementary program for adults called Tennessee Reconnect that works towards getting Tennesseans to have a post-secondary education. So whether that's a technical certificate or a community college degree or whatever it may be. And the results have been really promising. You've seen college-going rates increase. You've seen enrollment in community colleges increase. You've seen graduation rates at community colleges improve. But at the same time, the dropout rates, while improving, still could use a little bit of improvement. It's almost 50% of students are dropping out after 3 years using the program. So the idea is that, you look at these dropout rates and tuition's not a factor, but the other costs of college that a financial aid program doesn't address, like transportation or housing or the cost of books, are really, weighing on these low-income students.
And so, Reed, what has been learned in Tennessee that can and cannot be applicable to other states?
So for Tennessee, it has its own program. It was the first to offer to all students that were graduating from high school, but other states have their own versions of programs. Some have residency requirements, like New York requires you to live in the state after you receive the aid. Other states offer it for 4-year education, while some offer it for 2 or for specific areas or income brackets. But I guess what the lesson that I have heard from experts in this area is that a one-size-fits-all approach is really challenging, especially in something like higher education, where each state is different and each state has come up with their own program to serve them. So looking at it from a one-size-fits-all approach is really challenging. But that is different than having a federal framework and then giving states a little more wiggle room to decide what's best for themselves.
Coming up, the Bloomberg 50, from finance and politics to tech and entertainment. These are the people who shaped 2019 in unexpected ways.
And we've got an exclusive chat with one of the big names on the list, IAC CEO Joey Levin. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. Still ahead, growth opportunity for a greener smartphone.
Plus, is it time for the House of Coco Chanel to get into luxury watches?
Yes.
I know. I'm very clever.
First up, though, we've got to talk about the Bloomberg 50.
So who has the most subscribed to YouTube channel? Who's Big Oil's big deal maker? And just how fast did Popeyes run out of that famous fried chicken sandwich? Bloomberg reporters and editors from around the world, they have answered those questions and many more for the third annual list.
We cover a lot in this list. It is our look at the people in business, entertainment, finance, politics, and science and technology whose 2019 accomplishments merit recognition. We caught up with the editor behind it all, Brett Beacon.
So to get on the list, it's not really a Lifetime Achievement Award, and there's many people that I want to put on this list every year, but they don't really have any data or a metric to sort of prove why we should include them. So a lot of it is sort of looking at the numbers, looking at the figures and saying, okay, they did have a great year, and we can actually show this through a stock price going up or an acquisition or a million other ways we try to measure it.
Brett, I'm always curious about the kind of debates that you guys have as you're discussing all of these names, because I'm sure people are like, this name has to be on this list, and you're like, no, it doesn't have to be on this list.
There is a lot of that. There are a lot of people you look at and say, hey, this person, of course, is going to be on the list. And every year, I think, oh, this person's definitely going to be on the list. And then we get to the end, and they wind up not on it. And that sort of happens because we decide either that the metric isn't strong enough, that it wasn't basically important enough. That's the other thing that happens. A lot of people have metrics, but you sort of look at how business shapes up and you say, actually, if you think about it, this doesn't really merit inclusion.
Is there a name on the list that might surprise people that's not necessarily a household name, like Kylie Jenner or Rihanna?
Yeah, there are a lot of them, actually, and that's kind of what makes the list fun, is that for every Kylie or Rihanna, there's actually a lot of people in here that you've probably never heard of. Someone like Ritesh Agarwal, to me, is a really interesting story. So he's a 19-year-old. He decides to travel around India as a budget traveler and says, this is terrible. All these hotels have roaches and it's foam blocks for mattresses. What if I were to take hotels that are 150 rooms or smaller and sort of standardize? So have hot water in the showers, have actual mattresses, right? Eliminate the bugs in the room. So said, okay, I'll give this a shot. He's 26 now. He's worth more than $1 billion. His Oyo hotel chain is adding 70 to 80 hotels a day, which is absolutely insane. And they are by room now the number 2 hotel in the world and are poised to overtake Marriott pretty much early next year. So that story I found amazing. The most amazing little tidbit in there is that the way they use data and analytics to try to figure out what works. And they found that if they put portraits of Marilyn Monroe in the rooms, that people consider those hotels now boutique. And that actually increases revenue per available room 10 to 11% per hotel.
Wow. I love that. It's not always just single people. And I want to talk a little bit because it's one of our favorite storylines of the year. U.S. women's national team.
Yes.
A shoe-in to some extent on the list, in part because this was much more than just winning the World Cup.
So their metric actually is that the number of people that watched set records for any soccer game, not just for women playing, for men, for women, but they're also on the list because of their pay equity battle. And they have they're now basically, this is going to come to trial next year, and they're one of the groups on there that is fighting very hard for pay equity. And their argument is a pretty good one, which is that they actually play in more games. They've won 4 World Cups. Don't we deserve a little bit more here? And we're seeing actually elsewhere in the world that this is happening. Australia actually just granted their women's team the same amount of money as their men's team.
I also always wonder on this list, when you guys think about something that BusinessWeek covers so well, and that is big business corporate stories or business trends. Who among the business community was worth being on this list this year?
That's a great question. Somebody that I love is Ethan Brown. Right. If you look at business this year, really hard to overlook the world of fake meat. Right. Beyond Meat is his company. You've got Impossible, and now you've got pretty much every other company doing this well. But their stock price up about 200%. Since it launched this year.
It was a successful IPO.
Huge IPO. And it's just a space that is going to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars in the coming years. So he was kind of a shoo-in for that. That's just also an area that we've covered, at length. Kevin Mayer over at Disney with the launch of Disney Plus.
Yeah.
I mean, signing up nearly 10 million people, almost right away. And one of the themes throughout this list is you see we have Kevin Mayer on the list. Kevin Feige as well, who's over at Marvel with Avengers Endgame, and obviously they work together.
A couple of Kevins just changing the world over at Disney.
Exactly, and then you have people like Ann Sarnoff at Warner Brothers, right, who's charged with basically making HBO Max work. So you're seeing a ton in the streaming world this year. A lot of people on the list basically really responsible for reshaping how we watch TV.
Staying with the Bloomberg 50 and someone that made this year's list, IAC's Joey Levin.
The combined market value of the digital services incubator and Match Group, it's up to $10.5 billion this year. Levin worked on Wall Street right out of college, but when Barry Diller brought him over in 2003, he became a real deal maker. Here's my exclusive chat at IAC's world headquarters in New York City.
I came to IAC to do mergers and acquisitions, which is what I was doing as a banker. And really, Barry had told the market he wanted to spend $10 billion on acquisitions in the internet, and I thought that sounds like a lot of fun.
Right.
And this was 2003, and the internet was not popular. It was, people said, we advertising doesn't work on the internet. We're not buying eyeballs anymore, and this thing's overdone. And we thought, no, there's still a lot of opportunity here, and we did. We went and spent most of that money in travel, but we were very active in that, and M&A was very sort of core to the center of IAC, and so I got to know Barry and the Vice Chairman Victor Kaufman very well, who were all very involved in this process. And Dara was there then, who's now at Uber, and it was a great group of people who I learned a tremendous amount from. And started doing acquisitions, then started doing some finance stuff, and then started running my first business in 2009.
And so go back to sort of joining, and I mean, at that point, Barry Diller is capital B, capital D, Barry Diller. I mean, like he's not an unknown at that point. What were your first impressions of working for him?
It was funny. People had all these things of, okay, you're going into your first meeting with Barry, or you're going into a meeting with Barry, don't look at him. Don't look directly at him, but don't look away from him. I was like, wait. There was all these rules that people were trying to give me, and you go into the meeting, he's a regular person. He's very intense, and he's very sharp, and he gets to the point on everything very quickly, and sort of intolerant of kind of nonsense or waste, but he's just a person in a meeting. And the thing that I appreciated right away, and still appreciate today very much, is this culture of debate and discussion and challenging. And it's a lot of ways it's hard to do as a leader, because you say to everybody, essentially everything I say you should challenge, everything I say you should disagree with, everything, and to make sure that you get to the right answer. And it is definitively a better way of getting to the right answer, but it is a hard thing, and something that Barry has always embraced, and it doesn't work for everybody. Some people don't like that kind of culture, but it worked well for me and my personality, and we ended up getting along. But I didn't really get to know Barry, even though I was in meetings with Barry. I probably didn't get to know Barry until several years into being at IAC.
M&A has been at the core of this company in a lot of ways. Both buying and selling in many ways, and spinning off. How does that sort of help define the culture? Because there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of constant coming and going in many ways, and a lot of innovation, I would imagine, but also potential friction among all of these new things happening all the time. How do you manage that?
Well, there's a lot in there. We like the friction. We like that things challenge themselves and each other. We frequently have multiple businesses in the same category competing with each other. Our view is we'd rather disrupt ourselves than have somebody disrupt us, and so we're often, if we have a thesis on a category, we want several teams going after it and several businesses going after it, and it's okay if they compete with each other and challenge each other in going after that end result. Because in many ways you can predict some components of the future. No one can predict the future, but you can say, here's one way of doing something, and here's a better way of doing something. 5 years from now or 10 years from now, are people going to be doing it the better way or the worse way? Well, they're definitely going to be doing it the better way, right? Yeah. You don't know whether you're going to get the right team that's going to figure out how to do the better way better than the other people figuring out the better way, but you do know that that's what the future is going to look like. And so what we try and do is put a lot of bets against that future so that we can meaningfully participate in it. And that sometimes leads to conflict, that sometimes leads to multiple bets in the same category, or friction in your words, and that's something that's okay with us.
Coming up, Carol, Vodafone's calling with a potential greener take on the smartphone.
Plus, Jason, over at Chanel, the iconic fashion house gets serious about luxury watches.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. Join Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Bloomberg.com, wherever you find your podcasts.
And you can also find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app.
In this week's technology section, as far as human rights and the environment are concerned, smartphones are arguably a nightmare.
Not to mention they're difficult to repair and recycle. I am very scared of opening that up.
Never
voids everything. That is, unless you're a company in Amsterdam who has figured out how to fix that with what they call the Fairphone.
Checking in all that are Stefan Nicola in Berlin.
Well, the Fairphone is, the sustainable answer to all the other smartphones out there. Smartphones in general are pretty bad when it comes to sustainability. They are, built in questionable environments. They're using metals and minerals mined in war zones, and it's basically impossible to recycle them or repair them, meaning they'll often get tossed, and that's not a good thing, as we all know.
All right, so Stefan, I'm thinking that in this moment and movement, if you will, where I feel like folks are looking for greener solutions to everything, I'm curious why this hasn't happened sooner or taken off more. Tell us about, kind of put it in perspective, because we sell, more than 1 billion smartphones kind of around the world, yet this is just a small part of the market.
Yes, the Fairphone is still a niche product. Last year alone, 1.45 billion smartphones were sold around the world, and the Fairphone has a modest target of selling 150,000 models next year. However, these products are catching on. The Fairphone is special because it sources sustainable minerals from fair trade sources and from places where they ensure that there's no child labor or armed conflicts involved. It's using recycled plastics, and you can very easily take this phone out and open it up and repair it yourself for a fraction of the cost, getting your iPhone or Samsung Galaxy repaired.
That alone blows my mind.
Yeah,
right?
So let's talk about that specific element to it, because that was the thing
a screwdriver,
that really jumped out at me. Exactly. I mean, so how did they make something that one can actually fix oneself?
Yeah, so basically they had the problem, which is, when you have your iPhone when your iPhone's broken and you want to repair it yourself, that's basically impossible. Not only will you not be able to open it, but also you'll void the warranty if you do it. So they try to come up with an entirely new modular design that makes that possible. The phone ships with a tiny screwdriver that you can use to open the device and very simply, very easily replace 7 key components, from the screen that we all know breaks easily, to the camera, to the battery, to all kinds of key components that usually you won't see or touch in other smartphones.
Coming up, can Chanel make up for lost time in the business of luxury watches?
Plus, old age could be a beauty goldmine. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
In San San Francisco, a lot of tech action today.
Our top stories this morning in D.C. and
the Dow and the S&P.
Shall we? So the euro on a 7-day
sizable moves in the currency market. Temperatures down 0.5%.
We begin in the oil patch. Saudi Arabia.
Brent crude pretty much unchanged.
Welcome to Bloomberg, the first word Asia.
The U.S. and Japan duke it out over exchange.
China's slumping onshore bond market is great.
Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. You can also listen to us on the radio on Sirius XM channel 119, also AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital, and of course, always on the Bloomberg Business app.
Well, we turn now to two stories in the business section, both about expanding business.
That's right, Jason. The first one is about Chanel channeling the luxury watch business big time.
And the other about cosmetics for the elderly.
Got all the details from editor Jim Ellis.
We started out the story looking at Chanel's boutique on the Place de Vendôme in Paris, and it's facing all these other sort of well-known names in watches like Rolex. And there's Chanel, which is normally thought of as a female-centered brand that's big in real fashion and also in fragrance. And you think of the blazers and the purses, but you don't really think about watches as much, even though they've been in the watch business. Well, now they've decided to make a really big push into it. Now that's tricky simply because the brand is really associated with a very feminine sort of fashion orientation, and that's not where the biggest watch companies are. The biggest watch companies are things that men buy, and it's a male-focused kind of business. And this is a tough way for these Chanel people to sort of shoulder their way in.
So is it all about going after men specifically, or men and women? Are they all in on watches?
It's all in. I mean, they started out with a watch that's been successful called the J12, and it's a unisex watch.
Yeah.
And I mean, so it's sized and styled in a way that it looks good on both men and women. And
has it done well?
It has done well. However, it's just the beginning, because the thing is that other companies have had 100 years or a couple of 100 years in watches, and this is definitely a 110-year-old brand, but it's one that's been associated with fashion. And among true watch aficionados, the notion of a fashion watch is sort of that's not a compliment.
Yeah, I mean, watches are such a funny little corner of the market. I mean, we've talked a lot about the watch trade, as it were, with Chris Rouser, who runs the Pursuit section, who I imagine was somehow consulted in all of this. But, I do wonder why, not to be too cynical about Chanel, but what makes them so special? That they can figure this out.
Wait a minute, Jason. Chanel is special.
Okay,
let's just do that. But go ahead.
They have been, that's something that they've had to, sort of contend with among the inside watch crowd, and they've been not just people who wanted to sell watches, but they wanted to make better watches, and so they have invested in making their own movements, which is the real hard part of watchmaking. Not just putting a quartz movement on something, but instead saying, they're going to have mechanical, sort of specialists in Switzerland who are actually making their watches. They also own, minority ownership in very expensive Swiss watch companies, and so they actually know how to make watches. And it's been, it's been shown. They won the what's sort of the Oscars of watches in Geneva the last 2 years for best women's watch, and so one of them was extremely technical. So they have the product. The issue is, can you break into something that people have typically thought of as being sort of controlled by a few other companies, particularly at a price point that a luxury company needs to charge.
Okay, so going after watches big time. They already have a cosmetics line. I don't know if they have been looking into tapping the elderly consumer market, but if you go to Japan, apparently cosmetics for the elderly, that's a thing.
This was a wait what story for me, I have to say. I did not see this one coming. Tell us what's going on.
Well, it's, we all know that Japan is the oldest, has the oldest populace of any country right now. And so it wasn't a big stretch for consumer product companies to say, oh, the elderly, there may be a good market. But normally when you think about cosmetics, it's aimed at the young. Right. You sort of use young people as in all your advertising, and you sort of target everything everything about looking like you're 20 with skin of 20-year-olds. And instead, in Japan, where almost half the women now are over 50, and by
I love that over 50 is elderly. I'm just going to put that out there. But okay.
But in another 15, 20 years, more than half will be over 60.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a really, really aging population. And so all of a sudden, people have said, they shouldn't be ignored.
Right.
That there's money here. There's an affluent population too. And so therefore, if we pump products aimed at that market, we can sell a lot more. And so companies are sort of coming out with lines that look at that. So Shiseido, Polar Orbis, Kosei, they're doing that. And they're also using older influencers as well.
Well, that was one of the things that really jumped out at me is, in the same issue where we are celebrating rightly in the Bloomberg 50, Kylie Jenner, at the ripe old age of 22 with her line that she now does a deal with Coty. Here we have, throwback to, my era, Kate Moss.
Kate Moss.
45 years old.
45 years old.
As a spokesperson.
As a spokesperson for Kosei. And, and that is, 45, while it seems young to me, is not young in that world. And so therefore what they're saying is that, we are talking about your skin, more mature skin. And one of the really interesting things in the story is that Polar Orbis, which is one of the biggest cosmetics companies in Japan, is using one of its influencers, who's a woman who's the world's oldest beauty consultant. She's 99 years old. Wow. She works for Polar Orbis, and she's been sort of helping women with their skin for forever. And it was really interesting to see that, there are all sorts of tricks that, tricks or strategies that people use when they're dealing with older customers. It means that the bottles have to have larger text so that they can, it doesn't strain your eyes as much. It also means that you use wax on some of the eye products because it then doesn't hurt the thinning skin. And Shiseido is even selling combs, special combs that have little dots of black dye on the end of the teeth to go for your for the roots of the hair that's turning gray. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people are using now to say, okay, I understand that you're aging, but you can still be your best person, you look your best way, and we're going to help you with that. And thank you, spend money with my company.
Right. I love this story.
And does this have the potential, you think, to go global?
I think so, simply because it's not just Japan that's aging quickly. I mean, China, even though we think of China as this giant developing market, and it is, but it's also a rapidly aging market. And so China is where these companies now are all expanding as their next step. But also, the UK is also another market that has really aging populations, particularly aging female populations. So this is just something that's going to be a lot bigger in years to come.
Bloomberg BusinessWeek is available on newsstands now.
Also online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app. What's your must-read?
Bloomberg 50.
Got it big.
I mean, this is a great list. I love, we reach out across the organization, really whittle it down to 50 people with measurable reasons why you need to know about them. Some of them household names, some of them are not.
They're not, but we're going to be talking to a lot of them Monday night here in New York City. Tune in. We're going to have a live broadcast on our radio show from the big Bloomberg 50 celebration. We're going to be hosting it with Joel Weber.
And then we're going to feature some of the interviews also in next weekend's weekend show right here on Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
And more Bloomberg Television. It starts right now.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.